St. Petersburg rightfully holds the title of the Pearl of the North. It is perhaps the most granite-clad, majestic, and rapidly built city in the history of the empire. It is a place where one can enjoy walks year-round, admiring the aesthetic of its architectural ensembles. However, beyond the visual pleasure, this city offers the attentive observer a complex historical puzzle. If you possess a healthy dose of skepticism and knowledge that goes beyond the school curriculum, trying to imagine the real construction process of this metropolis leads to a dead end. Often, one's imagination simply fails to reconcile official data with the laws of physics and logistics. Even if you keep the approved version of events in mind, it only seems logical to those who prefer not to ask too many questions. Most people perceive history exactly as they were told in school. They accept information on faith, much like religious dogmas, without bothering with critical analysis. There is a certain everyday logic to this. Modern people have enough worries of their own without spending time thinking about the past. Questions may slip into one's mind, but few decide to seriously clutter their heads with them. Nevertheless, the main paradox of St. Petersburg cannot be ignored. How was it possible to build a city from scratch, comparable in size to Moscow at that time, in just 20 years? And not just build it, but move the capital there with all its administrative and functional duties? Official sources offer a universal explanation. Emperor Peter I sacrificed millions of human lives for the sake of construction speed. The logic of the textbooks is simple. If it is written that a huge number of people died on the construction site, then the construction was effective. The very existence of the city is used as proof of this theory. However, if we turn to the demographics and statistics of that time, serious contradictions arise. Even if you write the figure of 20 or 30 million workers on paper, in the reality of Russia's population back then, there was simply nowhere to physically get them. Moreover, a question of logistics arises. How did this giant army of builders get to the swampy terrain without a developed road network and without established maritime transport? The technological aspect raises even more doubts. One can imagine that hundreds of thousands of laborers were driven to the site, but the number of hands does not cancel out technological processes. You cannot erect walls before the foundation settles, and no number of people can speed up the curing of mortar or the processing of stone with primitive tools. These questions are usually left rhetorical, written off as genius organization or features of the era. But if we look away from the general panorama of the city and focus on the details, the inconsistencies become glaring. Among all the architectural splendor, there is one object that, like a lens, gathers all the oddities and contradictions of the official construction version. This is the Alexander Column. If you look at it closely, discarding the usual perception of a tourist attraction, it becomes obvious. Something is wrong with this monument. Official historians often dismiss people who doubt the capabilities of our ancestors, hinting at their lack of faith in human genius. However, in this case, we are not talking about the impossibility of erecting the column in principle. After all, it stands before us as an irrefutable fact. What is being questioned is the documented history of its creation, manufacture, and use, which, upon closer inspection, begins to crumble like a house of cards. The history of the creation of this majestic monument, at first glance, is documented in minute detail and should not cause any discrepancies. According to the approved version, the column was erected by the architect Auguste de Montferrand in 1834. This grandiose project was conceived as a symbol of triumph and eternal memory of the victory over Napoleon in the Patriotic War of 1812. And the structure itself was named in honor of Emperor Alexander I. By its characteristics, the monument has no equal. It is the tallest column in the world made of a single, monolithic piece of granite. Imagine a colossal polished rod simply placed on a granite base, like a figurine on a nightstand. The engineering audacity lies in the fact that the column stands exclusively due to its own monstrous weight. No fastenings, no cement mortar, or hidden locking mechanisms. Modern seismic tests and calculations confirm that such a structure possesses amazing stability. Even if surrounding buildings suffer from an earthquake, this granite rod will likely remain standing, becoming a kind of landmark amidst the ruins. The material for this giant, of course, was not lying around the streets of the capital. Huge granite masses had to be mined in Finland, which in those years was part of the Russian Empire, saving builders from customs formalities. The entire process was led by Montferrand himself, who left behind a rich legacy in the form of albums with drawings detailing every stage of the work, from cutting the blank to the final installation. And here we come to the key moment where the official chronicle begins to conflict with reality. Montferrand was not just an engineer. He was a high-class artist, a true virtuoso of the pencil. In the era before the invention of photography, such detailed sketches were the only way to document things. They were treated with the same seriousness as we treat photo chronicles or video reports today. An artist of that time did not have the right to abstraction if it concerned recording historical events. Photographic accuracy was required in rendering light, shadows, facial features, and even the shine of metals on the uniforms of nobles. Knowing the author's scrupulousness in details of portraits and interiors, it is logical to expect the same realism in the depiction of production processes. However, when we turn to the sketches from the Quarry, a picture appears that absolutely does not correspond to the physical nature of granite. This stone is one of the hardest rocks on Earth. Its processing requires colossal effort and specific tools. But on Montferrand's paper, the process looks as if the workers are dealing not with granite, but with pliable clay or a stick of butter that can be sliced smoothly with a knife. The quarry walls are perfectly even, and the blank for the column lies in the form of a flawless rectangular block, reminiscent of the ancient megaliths of Baalbek. There are no characteristic chips, cracks, or chaos that inevitably accompany the rough hewing of rock. The technology depicted by the architect implies the presence of tools capable of cutting the hardest rock with laser precision, which does not tie in at all with the level of technical development of the early 19th century. Moreover, official historiography, relying on these documents, traps itself in contradictions. In different sources, the weight of the extracted block varies from 700 tons to a fantastic 4,000 tons. The description of the state of the blank also floats. Sometimes it is a rough, unprocessed rock. Sometimes a practically finished product. Sometimes a certain intermediate surrogate. We are not talking about events from the time of the Egyptian pyramids, hidden in the mist of millennia, but about the comparatively recent past, the 19th century, an era of bureaucracy, blueprints, and reports. Why is there no single version among historians regarding the fundamental parameters of the object? It is claimed that all steps are documented and recorded, yet when attempting to balance the books in these reports, a feeling of surrealism arises. If Montferrand was capable of conveying the smallest details of the imperial wardrobe with jewel-like precision, why do his technical drawings of stone mining look like unscientific fiction that ignores the laws of geology? This discrepancy makes one wonder. Perhaps these drawings were not created from life, but are a later fantasy designed to explain the appearance of an object whose origin was a mystery even to the builders themselves. Careful study of the sketches left by the construction manager creates deep cognitive dissonance when trying to compare what is depicted with the harsh reality of mining work. Granite, as any geologist or builder knows, is one of the hardest and most unyielding rocks on the planet. Its processing is always a struggle, accompanied by noise, dust, and, most importantly, the unpredictability of fractures. However, on paper, the process of extracting the giant monolith looks discouragingly peaceful and technologically impossible for the early 19th century. The quarry walls in Montferrand's drawings appear perfectly vertical and smooth, as if carved by a giant laser or cut with a modern diamond wire saw. If we believe our eyes and the official documentation, the workers in the Petersburg quarry treated the granite cliff as if they were facing not the hardest rock, but a block of butter just taken out of the fridge. The images lack the characteristic traces of rough hewing. No chaotic chips, no piles of construction debris that inevitably arise when working with a chisel and hammer. The blank for the future column lies in the quarry as a flawless geometric body. It is a perfect rectangular prism with smooth faces and right angles. Such purity of lines is baffling, because even with the use of explosives or the wedge method available at that time, it is practically impossible to separate such an even block from the massif. Stone always breaks along the line of natural stress, leaving jagged edges that require long and laborious sanding. Here, however, we see a product that looks like it came out of a CNC machine. This picture evokes strong associations not with the hard labor of stonemasons in Tsarist Russia, but with the mysterious megaliths of Baalbek or Egyptian obelisks, the technology of which remains a subject of heated debate. As in the case of ancient civilizations, there is an inexplicable ease in handling colossal weights and volumes. Particularly suspicious are the so-called technical details on the blank itself. On the face of the granite block, specific rectangular holes are clearly drawn. Alternative history researchers know these marks well. Exactly the same indentations can be found on megalithic masonry in Peru, Egypt, and Lebanon. Official science usually ignores these elements or explains them as necessary for attaching rigging. However, their shape, depth, and placement suggest that these are traces from the impact of complex machinery, some kind of gripping or processing mechanism, the principle of which is unknown to us. These holes look alien to manual labor technologies that use ropes, chains, and wooden spacers. They are too neat and systematic. Furthermore, next to the column blank in the same drawings, one can notice another giant stone, which apparently was intended for the pedestal. And it too has a finished, regular shape, as if ready-made building blocks were simply lying in the rock, waiting to be picked up. Historians ask us to believe that this perfectionism is the result of the work of thousands of nameless stonemasons armed only with pickaxes and enthusiasm. But anyone who has ever tried to work stone by hand will understand the absurdity of such surface purity at the stage of rough mining. We are dealing either with the greatest artistic hoax, where the author embellished reality beyond recognition, or with documentary evidence of the use of technologies that do not fit into the usual chronology of progress. But even if we assume that miracle masters were able to cut a perfect cylinder from the rock, the real problems begin where the mining ends. After all, cutting the stone is only half the battle, and even the most perfectly cut diamond is useless if it cannot be lifted. The main absurdity and violation of all physical laws begin the moment they decide to move this multi-ton colossus and send it on a journey to St. Petersburg. Transporting such a grandiose object inevitably turns into a logistical nightmare, even if you possess 21st century technology. In the reality of the 19th century, according to official chronicles, this task was solved on a truly mythological scale, which makes one doubt not so much the engineering abilities of our ancestors as the sanity of the chroniclers themselves. The scenario of delivering the column from Finnish quarries to the capital reads like an adventure novel, where the laws of physics and biology retreat before the power of an imperial order. A special barge was built for transporting the monolith, and powerful decking and lever systems were constructed. It seemed everything was foreseen. The captain was handed a map, and the route was plotted. However, at the most crucial moment, during loading, a catastrophe occurs. The supports, allegedly poorly calculated by engineers, cannot withstand the monstrous pressure and break with a crash. The column, this granite colossus, begins its inexorable fall into the water. In any real situation, this would mean the end of the operation. Retrieving a sunken stone of such weight from the bottom with the technology of that time would be practically impossible. But the official history of St. Petersburg does not know the word impossible. A rescue squad of 600 soldiers comes to the aid, and this is where the real fantasy begins, worthy of comic book pages about superheroes rather than serious historical works. According to documents, these brave soldiers didn't just happen to be nearby. They completed a forced march that should have rewritten all sports standards forever. It is claimed that the soldiers covered 36 versts, about 40 kilometers, over rough terrain in just 4 hours. In metric terms, this is a full marathon distance. Let's imagine this picture for a second. 40 kilometers in 4 hours is the pace of a professional runner dressed in the lightest sportswear and cushioned sneakers. The soldiers ran in heavy boots, wool uniforms, likely with equipment, in the heat and off-road. After such a warm-up, which in itself should have driven people to complete exhaustion or heat stroke, they did not collapse. On the contrary, they immediately engaged in a battle with gravity. The plot states that these 600 atlases caught the falling or already fallen column and held it suspended. The absurdity of the situation reaches its peak when we turn to the numbers. The weight of the column varies in different sources, which is telling in itself. Sometimes it is 700 tons for the finished product. Sometimes 4,000 tons for the rough block. But even if we take the minimum bar of 700 tons and divide it by 600 people, it turns out that each soldier had to hold more than a ton of weight in their arms. And not just hold it like a weightlifter for a couple of seconds, but hold it for 2 days. That is exactly how much time, according to historians, it took the carpenters to build a new deck. 48 hours of continuous static tension, standing, probably waist-deep in water or mud, without sleep or food, holding a mass capable of crushing a tank. Many purely technical questions arise. How can you catch a sinking stone? It is not a drowning person to whom you can throw a life buoy. A granite cylinder has no handles or protrusions. How do you arrange 600 people around a lying monolith so that they can effectively apply force? And most importantly, why did historians need to invent this feat, which completely ignores the limits of human capabilities? In this story, the column behaves not like a physical object, but like a prop in a theatrical production. It changes weight, shape, and properties depending on the needs of the plot. Sometimes it is a boulder, sometimes a blank, sometimes a product. It is obvious that before us is not a documentary record of events, but a heroic epic designed to justify some completely different processes. If the delivery stage is described in such a fairy tale manner, where people turn into titans and granite loses weight, then what can be expected from the next stage? Installation? After all, if the delivery looks like unscientific fiction, then placing this behemoth on a pedestal in the center of the city turns into a real magic trick with disappearing parts and violations of the laws of mechanics. When the multi-ton granite cylinder, having overcome all conceivable and inconceivable obstacles on the way from Finland, finally found itself in the heart of St. Petersburg, the final act of this grandiose production began: the installation of the monument on Palace Square. From the point of view of official historiography, this event became the apotheosis of engineering thought and organizational talent. However, if we examine the assembly process through the prism of technical analysis and elementary logic, it raises no fewer questions than the marathon run of the soldiers with their cargo. Giant scaffolding, ramps, and complex pulley systems were constructed to lift the column, entangling the square in a web of ropes. The main role in this spectacle was assigned to 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of assistants, who had to act as a single, error-free mechanism. According to approved protocols, the operation to verticalize the monolith, with a weight comparable to that of a whole train, took only 1 hour and 40 minutes. This figure sounds not just like a record, but like a challenge to modern construction technologies. Even today, possessing powerful hydraulic cranes, computer load modeling, and laser positioning systems, installing such an object would take days, if not weeks, of painstaking preparation and millimeter shifts. We are asked to believe that in the first half of the 19th century, using only muscle power, hemp ropes, and wooden capstans, this task was solved in less time than it takes to watch a feature film. The lifting speed seems incredible also because any mistake, any wrong jerk or desynchronization of the efforts of 2,000 people would have led to a catastrophe. The stone would simply have crushed the scaffolding and the people. The technical documentation left by Malferon and engineer Betancourt attempts to explain this phenomenon, but in reality, only confuses the situation. Drawings of lifting mechanisms, pulley systems, and the arrangement of capstans look beautiful only on paper. Enthusiasts and engineers who tried to model this process according to historical drawings came to disappointing conclusions. The described scheme does not take into account real friction coefficients, rope tension angles, and material strength limits. If instructions were followed literally, the wooden structures should have crumbled and the ropes snapped long before the column left the ground. One gets the impression that the author of these schemes either had a poor understanding of applied mechanics or deliberately distorted the real picture, describing a process he never saw, or perhaps hiding the true technology of installation. Even more mysterious is the metamorphosis of the column body itself during these works. If we trace the chronology of events through numerous lithographs and drawings of that time, we can notice a strange detail. The object constantly changes its appearance. In some images demonstrating transportation and unloading, the granite rod is girdled with massive metal rings. These hoops were likely intended for rigging or strengthening the structure. However, at other stages, literally a few frames of the historical chronicle later, the rings vanish without a trace, and a perfectly smooth, polished rod appears before us. Where could these metal structures have gone? Removing them from a vertically standing column clamped in scaffolding is a non-trivial task. If we assume they were removed after installation, no traces of dismantling remained on the granite. They couldn't have sunk into the pedestal either, as the column stands on a flat base, held only by its own weight. These disappearing and appearing elements suggest that the artists were drawing different objects or simply copying fantasies from one another that had little in common with reality. The column on paper lives its own life, sometimes gaining details, sometimes losing them, as if it is not solid stone, but a plastic image in the creator's mind. This whole story with the lightning-fast installation and the changing appearance of the monument looks more like a magic trick than a construction report. The official version says that the design worked perfectly, and the pillar stood firm, breaking all world speed records. But behind the screen of this triumph lies something that falls out of the general orderly picture of the celebration. And the strangest thing is not even how exactly they placed this column, nor the fantastic speed of the work. The real dissonance arises if we look away from the central figure of the action and look closely at what is happening in the background of one little-known but documentarily accurate painting capturing this moment. There, amidst the scaffolding, lies a detail capable of overturning the entire understanding of what exactly was being done on Palace Square. Building the new, or digging up the forgotten old. Among the orderly row of official lithographs, blueprints, and ceremonial portraits designed to immortalize the creation process of the monument, there is one artistic testimony that stands out from the chorus and is capable of destroying the familiar worldview. We are talking about a painting by Prince Grigory Gagarin, depicting the Alexander Column in a dense ring of scaffolding. This canvas is in the public domain, adorning the pages of encyclopedias and historical portals, but surprisingly, its content is rarely subjected to critical analysis. At a cursory glance, the viewer sees only large-scale works, but one only has to linger on the details for an irresistible feeling of forgery, or, at least, understatement, to arise. In the painting, we see not a sterile construction site where a new shining symbol of the empire is being erected, but something completely different. The base of the column and the surrounding area do not look like the beginning of a great journey, but like the finale of some ancient drama. Instead of neatly stacked materials ready for assembly, strange, semi-destroyed brick structures appear before us. They do not look like temporary technical structures or supports for scaffolding that an official historian might claim. These ruins have the signs of capital buildings, old masonry, decorative elements, traces of erosion, and destruction that cannot be imitated in a couple of months of construction are visible. The brick skeletons look as if they have stood here for centuries, survived a cataclysm, and are now preventing workers from reaching the main goal. This visual dissonance forces us to reconsider the very essence of what was happening on Palace Square in those years. If we trust our eyes and not the captions in textbooks, the scene resembles not the erection of a new object from scratch, but a massive archaeological excavation or restoration of something incredibly ancient. The workers are not building, they are clearing. Scaffolding is erected not to lift a multi-ton monolith, but to wash it, repair it, or change its appearance to fit new ideological needs. The feeling of secondary use is reinforced by the fact that the column itself in the painting looks strangely organic amidst these ruins, as if it is the only thing that survived in its original form amidst the general chaos. Such an interpretation of events could explain many of the inconsistencies we discussed earlier at once. If the column already stood in this place, or lay nearby, being part of an ancient ensemble, then the need for fantastic stories about high-speed transportation, marathons with a 700-ton load, and instant installation disappears. The record speed of work in this case is explained simply. Restoring and digging out is always faster than mining and building anew. Perhaps that is why Montferrand's drawings differ so much from reality. They were not a construction plan, but a project for adapting an ancient object to the realities of the 19th century. The architect did not create a masterpiece, he attributed it to himself, simultaneously masking the traces of a past civilization that possessed technologies unavailable to his contemporaries. The presence of clear traces of destroyed ancient buildings in the immediate vicinity of the column in Gagarin's painting hints that St. Petersburg was not built on an empty swamp, but, perhaps, was restored on the ruins of a much older city. A city that was destroyed by an unknown cataclysm, leaving behind only granite embankments, polished megaliths, and the skeletons of buildings that would later be called Petrine Baroque. And if we allow the thought that the column is a legacy of another era, a miraculously survived lighthouse of a forgotten civilization, then a logical question arises. What, then, is on its top? If the body of the column is ancient, then the top could have been replaced or altered to match the new legend. To whom is the monument, gazing at the city from a dizzying height, actually dedicated? It is time to look at the angel closer, for his appearance holds no fewer secrets than the granite base beneath his feet. A gaze sliding up the perfect surface of the granite monolith inevitably rests on its crowning part, the figure of an angel, which was supposed to be the final chord in the symphony of imperial greatness. However, it is here, at a dizzying height, that the concentration of oddities and contradictions reaches its peak, completely confusing the traces of the true origin and purpose of this structure. The official legend states that the sculptor Boris Orlovsky gave the angel's face the features of Emperor Alexander I, thereby immortalizing the memory of the victor. This seems logical and a politically correct move for that time. But one only has to lower one's gaze slightly below the royal face and a discouraging question arises. Why does the Russian autocrat and commander-in-chief of the army have the body of a woman? The anatomical proportions of the figure are completely unambiguous and leave no room for other interpretations than acknowledging an obvious gender mismatch. Sloping shoulders, a clearly defined chest, wide hips smoothly transitioning into legs, and a general softness and roundness of forms. All these are characteristic signs of a female body. There is no military bearing, no muscularity typical of male antique statues or images of warrior monarchs. Some researchers, trying to find at least some rational explanation for this incident, suggest that the sculptor may have been inspired by the image of the poetess Elisabeth Kuhlmann, for whom he had tender feelings. But to assume that a statue of the sculptor's beloved was secretly installed on the main state monument of the empire, instead of the figure of the Tsar, is to admit the complete incompetence of the censors, customers, and Nicholas I himself, who personally oversaw the project. Most likely, the figure was originally female, and perhaps stood here long before the legend of Alexander was attached to it. Or the meaning of the statue was completely different, allegorical, which was later roughly fitted to the official ideology. The angel's clothing also causes bewilderment. Instead of a uniform, or at least neutral garments, he is dressed in a traditional Roman toga, which refers us to antiquity and not to the events of 1812. But the most glaring dissonance is caused by the cross that the angel clutches in his hands. In the Orthodox Russian Empire, where religion was a pillar of statehood, a four-pointed Latin, that is, Catholic cross, is installed on the top of the capital's main monument. The absence of a slanted crossbar, mandatory for the Orthodox tradition, cannot be explained by simple negligence or artistic vision. The angel's need for the religious consciousness of 19th century people, this would be tantamount to ideological sabotage. Historians usually pass over this sharp corner in silence, suggesting not to look for deep meaning where, in their opinion, there is none. However, if we turn to old lithographs and engravings made in different years, the situation becomes even more mysterious. In many images, the top of the column looks completely different. Instead of the cross we are used to, strange objects can be discerned in the figure's hands. Sometimes it is a long spire, sometimes a structure with spheres, sometimes something resembling a trident or a complex antenna. Coupled with the angel's pose, one hand raised to the sky, the other lowered down, a strong impression of technical functionality is created, as if this figure acts not as a religious symbol, but as a conductor, an element of atmospheric electricity, or part of a lost communication system. An antenna in its purest form, which at later stages of restoration or rewriting of history was replaced, or simply drawn over in textbooks, with the understandable and safe symbol of the cross. Completing this composition is the snake located at the angel's feet. The traditional interpretation says that the serpent symbolizes defeated evil, that is, Napoleon's army, trampled by the victor's heel. But if you look closely, the snake does not look crushed or dying. It calmly wraps around the base of the cross, or that very antenna. Its pose does not express suffering. In ancient symbolism, the snake often meant wisdom, knowledge, or earth energy. Here, it looks more like a necessary structural element, a grounding or companion, rather than an enemy. This domestic serpent of the Garden of Eden, peacefully coexisting with an antique female angel holding a Catholic cross with antenna functions, creates a surreal cocktail of symbols. All these seemingly disparate details, the female anatomy of the emperor, alien religious attributes, technical oddities in old drawings, and the ambiguous snake, form a single puzzle that official history cannot assemble. Or, more likely, does not want to, as the resulting picture will completely destroy the myth of 19th century construction and force us to admit that we are dealing with an object of a completely different purpose and origin. This monument is not just a memory of war. It is clear evidence of a global forgery, where real artifacts of the past were hastily remodeled to fit the needs of the new power. Summing up this large-scale investigation, it is necessary to clearly place the accents and separate the grains of common sense from the chaff of fantasies that are imposed on us from both sides of the barricades. When we speak of the untenability of the official version of the construction of the Alexander Column, we are not talking about the intervention of little green men, levitation magic, or help from alien curators descending from the heavens on chariots of fire. Such theories only discredit serious researchers, turning historical analysis into a circus. The truth is likely much more prosaic, but therefore more frightening. We are dealing with a global bureaucratic forgery. The entire aggregate of facts, from Montferrand's physically impossible drawings to the biologically absurd feats of soldiers, indicates that 19th century documents were created retroactively. It was a grandiose paperwork job designed to legitimize the appropriation of heritage that the new government did not build, but merely found, dug up, and adapted to its needs. The Alexander Column, like many other monumental structures in St. Petersburg, appears before us not as the creation of serf masters with chisels, but as a silent witness to another civilization. A civilization that possessed a completely different level of industrial development, different stone processing technologies, and, perhaps, a different understanding of physical laws. Those who are today dismissed with the derogatory term naysayers are actually a community of people who have retained the ability for critical thinking and elementary mathematical calculations. These people do not deny the greatness of their ancestors. They only doubt that these ancestors were idiots trying to solve Stone Age engineering problems with methods that inevitably lead to disaster. Naysayers are those who understand. You cannot run a marathon in army boots in world record time. You cannot polish granite to a mirror shine by hand without machine equipment. And it is impossible to lift thousands of tons on ropes that snap under their own weight. Most likely, historical documents and Montferrand's colorful albums were written not on the construction site, but in the quiet of offices, years or even decades after the object was put into operation. The customers needed to fit the majestic ruins of the past into the new chronology of the Romanov Empire, to create a myth of continuity and power. That is why the column changes its appearance from drawing to drawing. That is why technological rings disappear and Christian crosses appear in the hands of antique statues. We see an attempt to force a square peg into a round hole, to explain the existence of a high-tech object with primitive means available in the 19th century. And this attempt bursts at the seams at the slightest touch of logic. The column could have had a completely different purpose. Its ideal shape, polishing, and strange top in the form of an antenna on old engravings. All this hints at the functional, technical nature of the structure. Perhaps it was part of a unified city energy system, a navigation beacon, or a cult object of the antediluvian era, the meaning of which was lost along with its creators. We were left with a beautiful fairy tale about the victory over Napoleon so that unnecessary questions would not disturb the minds of the subjects. But stone remembers the truth. Traces of machine processing, inconsistencies in logistics, ruins at the base, these are all clues that cannot be completely destroyed. We are only at the beginning of the journey to unravel this tangle of lies. St. Petersburg is not just a city built by Peter on swamps. It is a giant palimpsest where new lines, convenient for official ideology, are written over ancient texts. But the old writings show through the centuries. The realization that history can be completely falsified is frightening, but at the same time, it opens up exciting prospects for finding the truth. If you are ready to look at the world with wide open eyes, if you are not satisfied with fairy tales from school textbooks and want to know who the builders of this 1,000-year-old city really were, stay with us. We have only just begun to peel the layers of plaster from the facade of official lies.